I'm standing before you at another awful time. There's been more Islamophobia now in the United States since 9/11, this last year. And you may notice I am struggling with a very bad cough, and I've just had some stuff given to me for it, but Tori noticed that the cough started just about the time when Donald Trump was landing at the airport. But it's really great to be here in Louisville. I've enjoyed my visits here before, but this time coming back, it's very special because Louisville has become absolutely central to our project for building a network of compassionate cities. Louisville has become one of the best of our cities, determined somehow to implement, to insert the difficult virtue of compassion into the gritty reality of urban life in the 21st century. And it's absolutely crucial. That this is done. Because if compassion remains simply an airy notion, sort of kumbaya, a soft option where people are just nice to one another in their private lives, and somehow do not make it work politically or socially, I really feel we have very little hope of handing the next generation with a viable world. Because I've come to the conclusion that compassion is not just a nice idea, it's now an urgent global imperative. I came to this with difficulty. I had not experienced religion, for example, as a compassionate enterprise, to put it mildly. But I wrote a book called The Great Transformation, when all our great world religious traditions came into being at about the same time, in India, in the Middle East, and in Greece, in Europe. And every single one of them, in their own way, quite independently, came to the conclusion that the bedrock of spirituality and ethics was what we now call the Golden Rule. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. And insisted that this, and not a particular belief or a doctrine or a political position, this was at the heart of all our religious traditions. It was the test of true spirituality. And yet, I was getting frustrated because you heard so little about it. Very often when religious leaders come together, they were often here to condemn something, like condemn homosexuality, for example, or coming to profess a particular doctrine. But you didn't hear about this one thing that the world needs at the moment. Because unless now we learn to implement the Golden Rule globally, and it begins in cities, I think, the world is simply not going to be viable for it, because we've not done it in the past, and we're now beginning to reap some of the rewards of this. The Golden Rule requires you to look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. One of the first people to propose the Golden Rule in a way that was written down was Confucius in the 5th century BCE. And he said, you do this all day and every day, not just when you feel like it. It has to become an absolute habitual practice. In England, we have a habit when we've done something nice for somebody, we often say, well, that's my good deed for the day, as though we can then return to the next 23 hours to our usual habits of greed and unkindness and bitterness. No, all day and every day. And it requires you to transcend the self. That is why it's so important in spirituality. Now, they all insisted too that you could not confine this benevolence to your own particular group. You had to have what another Chinese sage called yan ai, concern for everybody. You have this in the monotheistic traditions too. Love the stranger, the foreigner, says Leviticus. If a foreigner lives with you in your land, do not molest him. You must treat him as one of your own people and love him as yourself. For you were strangers in Egypt. And here you have the logic of the golden rule. Remember the times when you were a despised, oppressed, marginalized minority in a foreign land in Egypt, and make sure that nobody in your vicinity, in your own country, has to suffer such pain in your society. And the word love, I think, needs decoding here, because one of the problems we're having with compassion is that it's got kind of soft and mushy, a bit full of kumbaya, and that this toughness tends to be dissipated. Love, for example, in English has got really debased. You know, I love ice cream. Didn't you love that movie? Or else it suggests a sort of great welling of emotion. But in the ancient Near East, at the time Leviticus was written, love, hesed in Hebrew, was a political term, political legal term used in treaties, international treaties. Two kings who may have been enemies previously would promise to love each other. And that didn't mean that they would fall into one another's arms and become best friends, best buddies. Love meant loyalty. It meant that they would look out for one another's best interests, even if this went against their own short-term goals. That they would come to their aid of their new ally when he was in trouble. And they would do all they could to give him practical help and support. Now, this is the kind of love we need to give our so-called enemies today if we want a peaceful world. And Jesus said, love your enemies here. And the fate of Jesus reminds us that compassion can be dangerous. Here's a man who, in the Gospel of Mark, at the end of chapter 1 of this earliest of the Gospels, is so besieged by suffering, desperate people that he can't leave the city. We sometimes read the Gospel piecemeal in church. We don't get the full effect of this. Jesus is claustrophobically surrounded by suffering people at the end of their tether. They're sick, they're blind, they're deaf, and many of them are deranged. Demented, filled with, they said, devils. And the Gospel says that they are struck down with, the Greek words used mean that he looked at them and he saw that they were hard-pressed, and the Greek words used means with imperial predation. Jesus was a political figure, and he was killed by the Roman authorities for asking for a fairer, more compassionate world. And other people we've seen in the 20th century, Dr. King, Gandhi, who preached the compassionate ethic very effectively, but paid the ultimate price. So in becoming a compassionate city, one's taking on a great risk and a great challenge, and it won't always be easy. It's not about being nice. I personally am not filled with peace and love and joy. If I'm filled with anything, it's a kind of dread. I never intended to get into all this business about talking about religion or writing about Islam. My goal was to be a university professor teaching English literature, and it didn't happen. But a turning point for me was during the Salman Rushdie crisis. And there, if you remember, the Ayatollah Khomeini, on his deathbed, his government had issued a fatwa saying that the Salman Rushdie and his supporters and his publishers could be killed. This was outrageous, went against major Islamic and indeed Iranian Shiite ideology. And of course, I was dead against that. But I was also utterly horrified by the way the liberal intellectuals of Britain, and these were not just little unknown people, they were major novelists, philosophers, intellectuals, and journalists, segued from an out-and-out denunciation of the fatwa to a denunciation of Islam as an essentially evil and bloodthirsty religion. And I remember sitting surrounded by the Sunday papers and thinking that this reminded me of the 1930s and 1940s. It was this kind of rhetoric used by Hitler that had made the concentration camps possible, by dehumanizing. And at the end of that decade, at the end of the 90s, there were concentration camps again around the periphery of Europe, this time with Muslims in them, in Bosnia. So there's that kind of dread and urgency I have. So, as I say, it's hard work, and we have somehow to find a way to grapple with the political realities of our time and make compassion, to feel with the other, to treat others, all others, as we would wish to be treated ourselves, a real reality. If we British had behaved with more respect to the people in our colonies during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, we would not be having so many political problems today. Things are coming back to haunt us. Now, the people who founded the Golden Rule, started it up, were all living not in peaceful, idyllic groves. Like Jesus, they were living in times where violence and injustice and suffering had reached an unbearable crescendo. China, for example, at the time of Confucius, was just embarking on a terrible period of Chinese history. It's often called the Warring States period, because for over 200 years, all the states, the small states on the big Great Plain of China, fought one another with desperate, terrible casualties for over 200 years, most of the casualties among the peasantry, until there was only one state left. The others were all destroyed, and that became the Chinese Empire. And Confucius his golden rule was not just a private imperative, though it was that too. His whole life was spent tramping from one court to another, trying to make the rulers of China observe the golden rule. Because he said, if we don't behave to each other as we would wish to be others to behave to us, we will destroy one another. And that has never been more true than it is today. A little while ago, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, I did a video link up. I think perhaps it was with this festival in Louisville. And I was in London at home and was speaking to an audience somewhere. And somebody asked me, what should a compassionate city look like? What should it be like? And I said, a compassionate city should be an uncomfortable city. Why? Because, and here, I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I believe the Prophet Muhammad once, peace be upon him, once said, not one of you can be a believer if he can sleep when he knows that someone is hungry. And we know, because we are inundated with images of suffering and pain more than any previous generation, we know that not only are people hungry, they are on flimsy boats, little rafts, literally dying to get into Europe. They are enduring on a daily basis what the Europeans endured for 1 or 2, 3 days last year. There's hunger, and there's disease and massive inequity. And sometimes, when we look at these, we get, someone called it once, compassion fatigue. We think, I can't deal with this, I don't want to see it. But we should see it as a spiritual opportunity. We should perhaps fix on one of those images, perhaps a child. One I'm thinking of was literally dying in its mother's arms in a refugee camp in Europe, and call it during the day, and let it trouble us, because that trouble, that discomfort that we feel when we are living lives of such utter privilege here, that is like the grain of sand in the oyster that creates the pearl. And it's that discomfort that creates true compassion. To allow ourselves to realize, not to be miserable all the time, that's not the point, but that won't help anybody. But to say, what can we practically do to assuage this? It's about pain. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstances that not to do this to anybody else. Now, we are living in an interconnected world. We're linked together, our economies are so interdependent that when markets fall in one part of the world, stocks plummet all around the globe that day. We all face the same environmental possibility of disaster. We're linked together electronically in a way that would once have been conceivable on the World Wide Web. People can look into their phones now and see the way we live. No wonder they want to come to our privileged world. And yet, the more global we become, the more tribal people want to feel. We've got this ludicrous thing going on, a terribly dangerous thing going on in Britain at the moment. Should Britain leave the European Union? And people are saying absurd things like, we must be proud again. Rubbish. Rubbish. We need Europe. 100 years ago, Europeans were killing one another in these disastrous wars. The fact that we're sitting round table, however ineptly, tackling day-to-day problems is a triumph. Scotland tried to leave the European Union. And the United Kingdom, to go it alone. Fortunately, that did not work out, that wish. So, similarly, in the religious world, the more global our vision comes with interfaith, the more some people want to retreat to denominational ghettos. That's why you have fundamentalism, where people feel threatened by this likeness and want to hold on to this nugget of individuality. But this is not a rational assessment. I think the Dalai Lama has said this. This is not a rational assessment of our current situation, which is interdependence. So the suffering we're seeing in other parts of the world has already redounded on us. And this is in no way condoning these terrorist acts, but this has come from decades of neglect and selfishness and pursuit of the wrong kind of policies, not supporting rulers or regimes in various countries of the world that would give their people none of the liberties that we enjoy. We're not doing it. That's not the golden rule. Don't impose on others, said Confucius, what you yourself do not desire. Now, we had some bad days in Europe, I mentioned them. And this is heartbreaking. One of the things that's happening, you see, is that we are now, in the privileged West, are beginning to endure some of the privations that people in these other countries that we've been helping to keep in this bad state have felt all along. There are certain places now where it's not really safe for us to go on holiday. Our world is beginning to shrink. When we go through the airport, we have all this palaver with, taking our shoes off and looking out, and we all get frightened when something like Egypt Air happens. Is it another terrorist attack? But this is only a pinprick of the fear and lack of freedom that people have around the world, which is these migrants. Now, the Charlie Hebdo massacre in January was it was an atrocious crime. An atrocious crime. But when I saw those European and world leaders linking arms and marching together for freedom and liberté and freedom of expression, I felt quite sick, because many of them, including my own Prime Minister, had, as I say, for decades supported regimes like Saudi Arabia in Muslim-majority countries which allow their people no freedom of expression at all. And we only seem to mourn our own people. A few weeks before that Paris catastrophe, 145 Pakistani children had been shot dead by the Taliban. Just a day or two after, 2,000 villagers, men, women, children, and the elderly, had been slaughtered by Boko Haram. Small, tiny mentions in the press compared with the Paris bonanza. And this is noticed in the Muslim world. The other day, Tori gave us that magnificent talk where she showed the number of people who've died. 90% of the people who have died in Afghanistan and Iraq in the wars were civilians who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, we never really mention them. We quite rightly mourn our dead servicemen who come back from these terrible places and have paid the ultimate price. But we must also remember these others too. Otherwise, it looks as though we think that some lives are more valuable than others. And this is not unnoticed. Just shortly after that Paris catastrophe, I visited Jordan, and I was giving a talk to a small group. It was a closed group, no cameras or anything. They were members of the royal family, diplomats, statesmen, members of the diplomatic community. And one of them, and these were not a bunch of hotheads, one of them was the foreign minister who had brokered the peace treaty with Israel. And he said, the West has lost its humanity. You don't care about our dead. The fact that one of the princesses got up and said, we are also terrorized by these people. Far more Muslims have died at the hands of extremists than Western people. And as I said earlier, that day in Paris was just a pinprick to what these people have been enduring in Syria. Paris would have been an almost daily occurrence. After the last attack, Paris attack in November, 2 days earlier, 44 people in Beirut had been killed by 2 IS suicide bombers. And they were never mentioned. As soon as we died, then up went the tricolor, the French flag on every building. Why not the Lebanese flag too? And the Lebanese noticed it. They said that none of this matters, that we don't matter. This is not a good feeling to spread around the world. We're not seeing that compassion, that fellow feeling. Your pain is my pain. I want to end with a story. Amin has heard it before. I often finish my speeches with it. I haven't done it for some time because I've been concerned with other things like Paris and such. But this is really speaking to us now. It's from Homer's Iliad. It's, as you know, the Iliad tells the story of a small incident in the long 20-year war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And in the course of this terrible warfare, Agamemnon, the king, has a quarrel with his leading warrior, Achilles. And Achilles, in a fit of egotistic pique, marches off to his tent and sulks, and more importantly, he withdraws all his men from the battlefield, from the battle. This is disastrous, absolutely disastrous for the Greek side. Achilles is their star. Nobody can beat him. And in the course of this horror, this mess that's occurred, Achilles' beloved friend Patroclus is killed in a skirmish by Hector, one of the princes of Troy. And Achilles goes mad with guilt, grief, and rage. And he challenges Hector to a duel. The two of them will slug it out. And they do so. The royal family, Hector's family, watch from the Trojan walls. And nobody can beat Achilles, though. And he kills Hector. And then he mutilates the body. He, determined to take revenge, he ties Hector's body onto his war chariot and drags it round and round and round Patroclus' grave. And then he does a terrible thing. He refuses to give the body back to the family for burial. And in Greek terms, that meant that Hector's soul would never know rest, but it would be restless and distressed for all eternity. But then one night, Hector's father, old King Priam of Troy, comes in disguise into the enemy camp. Great danger, great risk. And he finds his way to Achilles' tent, and then he throws off his disguise. And of course, everybody is utterly shocked. Here is the king, the chief enemy in enemy territory. And the old man approaches Achilles. Achilles, who has killed not just Hector, but many others of his sons. And he falls at Achilles. The old man falls at Achilles' feet, embraces his knees, and weeps. And Achilles looks at the old man, and he remembers his father, and he begins to weep. And Homer says the two men wept together, Priam for Hector and for all the sons that, as he called him at this point, man-slaughtering Achilles had slain. And Achilles, now for Patroclus, now for his father. And then they stop weeping. The Greeks believed that weeping together created a bond between men because it showed the pain that lies at the heart of all our experience, all of us, whatever side we're on. And Achilles, the two men look at these great arch enemies, look into each other's eyes. And Homer tells us that each saw the other as divine, as a god. And then Hector goes. Achilles goes and he brings Hector's body and lays it very tenderly in the father's arms, Priam's arms, because the weight might be too much for him to bear. And that, I think, should be an emblem of our time. Two wounded men, arch enemies, both of whom have damaged each other irreparably, and they're two peoples that have damaged each other irreparably. But they have felt that bond of compassion that unites them, and it is that which makes us truly godlike, truly divine, when we recognize that our so-called enemies also have pain. Thank you.